Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and those of you that are regular listeners know how I love to bring to you people who have been working on their own growth and development and also are committed to helping others achieve their full potential. And I am just so thrilled about my guest today because she has been doing both of these things for decades, both through her entry into a profession that was male-dominated and still is, and in her work to advance other women. It is such a pleasure to have as my guest today, Jill Tietjen. Jill, welcome to my show.
Thank you, Meredith. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, I want to thank also our mutual friend and colleague, Jeanette Sibley, because she's the one who introduced us. And I'm just so grateful for that because of who you are in the world. And now you're a part of my world. And I'm so glad that you are.
Yes, she's actually a wonderful supporter. And I truly appreciate that she introduced us as well.
Well, one of the things that Jill and I discovered right away is that we have a lot of common ground because she grew up in Hampton, Virginia, which for those of you that might not be familiar with the geography, it's Southeast Virginia near Williamsburg. And it's not far from where I've lived the last 30 years. She also attended University of Virginia, and our daughter did too. But there are some striking differences in their experiences because of how many years apart they were in entering that school. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But first, I want to let you know what an amazing human being this guest is today. Jill is an author, an international speaker, and an electrical engineer. And after more than 45 years in the electric utility industry, her professional focus is now on women's advocacy worldwide. She speaks internationally on the accomplishments of women. She proactively nominates women for awards, and she continues to write books. As of right now, I think it's 12, right, Jill? I know you have others in the works, but I think 12 is the number that have actually been published.
That's correct, 12.
And her first two books that were focused on women have been bestsellers and award winners. And the first one was called Her Story, a timeline of the women who changed America. The second one is Hollywood, Her Story, an illustrated history of women and the movies. And today we're going to focus on her latest award-winning book, which I just love. It's called Over, Under, Around, and Through: How Hall of Famers Surmount Obstacles. And this was released in May of 2022 by Fulcrum Publishing. Jill has been inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, the Colorado Authors Hall of Fame, and the National Academy of Construction. These are such impressive credentials, Jill. You have this wonderful human side, though, that brings us down to earth, right, from all these wonderful credentials that you have. So I would love for you to start and give us kind of the compressed journey. And you can start at University of Virginia if you want to, or wherever it makes sense, to tell us how you got to be doing the work you're doing today.
I think it does make sense to start with the University of Virginia, actually. I was part of the third class of women who were admitted as undergraduates. That was in the fall of 1972. A young woman in 1969 from Charlottesville, actually, wanted to attend the University of Virginia as an undergraduate, but they weren't admitting women as undergraduates. And she sued. And the University of Virginia, very short story, opted then, they didn't get as far as the court order, but opted to admit women in the fall of 1970. My class was the first class that didn't have a cap on the number of women who could be admitted. And I started as a math major in the College of Arts and Sciences because no one, not anyone in high school, no guidance counselor, no teacher, not even my PhD engineer father, who worked at NASA Langley. And Hampton, Virginia is actually the site of the movie Hidden Figures. Not even dad told me that with the aptitudes and interests that I had, that I should consider engineering. But I figured it out my first semester. And I went to the dean of engineering and made all the arrangements to transfer effective second year, which many other colleges call sophomore year. And there were 7 women in my class out of 220, but I could see that there were more women coming after me. And so I thought the reason why there were so few women in engineering at UVA was because there were so few women at UVA.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to work at Duke Power Company in Charlotte, North Carolina, after I graduated, that I realized it wasn't just UVA, it's actually the whole engineering field. And in 1979, when I was doing on-campus recruiting for Duke at North Carolina State University, at a card table, at a career fair, in a gymnasium, that I found the Society of Women Engineers. And through that organization, I started very proactively recruiting young women to engineering. And through my UVA years, through my career, began to understand how very few women there were in engineering and how few women were advancing up the ranks. I didn't actually have my first female client until 2002, and I graduated in 1976. She's now a very dear friend of mine. But also along the way, in 1980s, well, in the mid 80s, once I moved to Denver in 81, one of the women in the Society of Women Engineers here in Colorado put her wing over me or adopted me or something like that and said, we're going to start nominating the women who were the founders of what was then called the Denver section of the Society of Women Engineers for fellow. And so she taught me how to write nominations. And then in 1987, my friend and colleague Alexis Swoboda went to the national convention and came back to Denver and said, Jill, I heard about an outreach program. I think we should do it. It's an essay contest on great women in engineering and science. And I said, that's a great idea, Alexis, but I don't know who they are. I knew one. That was Marie Curie. And so we started researching all of these women so that we could hold this essay contest. And there's way more than one. And so then I was elected to the national board of the Society of Women Engineers in 1988. And at my first meeting, the president held up the nomination forms for the National Medal of Technology and the National Medal of Science, the U.S. equivalent of the Nobel Prize awarded by the President of the United States, and said, who's going to do nominations? 17 women in that room, and no one raised her hand. So I did. And in 1991, I was at the White House Rose Garden to receive Admiral Grace Murray Hopper's National Medal of Technology, the nomination that I worked on for 2 years in order to submit it. And as I looked around the White House Rose Garden, I went, all right, so where are they? Because Admiral Hopper was the first individual woman to receive the National Medal of Technology. And it was unfathomable to me that there weren't other women who were getting awards. And in 92, that was 91. In 1992, Alexis found the National Women's Hall of Fame. We looked at the women who were inducted, who were all wonderful women, but where were the scientific, technical, engineering, and mathematics women? And we made it our mission to nominate those women because girls need the STEM role models too. And so my first successful nomination was Admiral Hopper in 1994. She had died by then. The family had asked me to receive the medallion at the National Women's Hall of Fame. And so I became hooked on making sure that women received recognition for their accomplishments. And that then evolved into articles, and it evolved into presentations, and it eventually evolved into books. And so I think I've answered the question.
Yeah, you sure did. You sure did, in spades. And so what I think would be so great to explore is, what was the evolution or the spark that caused you to want to write your new book here, Over, Under, Around, and Through? Where did that idea come from?
That idea came from a virtual happy hour in May of 2020 during the pandemic. Now, very few people, I do know a couple people who knew about virtual happy hours before the pandemic, but most of us learned about virtual happy hours during the pandemic. And in May of 2020, one of my friends, who is a former board member of the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, said during a virtual happy hour, you know, Jill, I think you should write a book about the women in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame and how they overcame the obstacles in their life. And her name is, unhelpfully for this conversation, also Jill. And so the other Jill and I had a telephone call, and I said, I just would like to understand what you're thinking, how it would proceed, those kinds of things. And she suggested that I contact my friend and mentor, Ellie Greenberg, who was also an inductee. In fact, I did her nomination to the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. And I asked Ellie if she thought she would be interested in writing a book like this. And she invited me over to her back patio, where we sat socially distant, using takeout that Panera Bread dropped in my back window in my car. That was where we were in the pandemic in June of 2020. And we're sitting out on her back porch. And I said to Ellie, well, what do you do when you're faced with an obstacle? And she made a little hand motion, a little wavy hand motion that said she didn't see it as an obstacle. She went around it. And that's when I knew we could write this book. And so we decided we were going to interview these women, many of whom have been inducted into all kinds of halls of fame all over the world. We were able to interview 31 of them. And then 31 is not a good number. 50 is a good number. And so the other 19, I researched historical, meaning deceased, women from the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame to see if I could find a story, to figure out an obstacle that they had overcome, the way in which they had overcome that obstacle. And then in the interim, and so that's 19 more, so 50 stories. And then Ellie and I were also doing literature reviews and research on skills that individuals use to overcome obstacles in their lives. And so we ended up with 10, because you can only have 10 of anything in a list. There's really 13, but they're in 10 categories because we smushed some of them together and then just slotted the stories, not forced the stories, slotted the stories into the skills that individuals use, the primary skill, because we all use skills to face these obstacles, and put the stories, 350 to 450 word stories, in the predominant skill that was used to overcome what are, in fact, very significant obstacles in their life.
Yeah, I found that so interesting as I was reading about each one, because I was reading one that might be categorized in a specific area, but I could see multiple traits or skills that they were able to use. I'm curious, Well, first of all, would you just quickly list them for us so we can get a sense of what did those entail, and then zero in on one or two that you thought emerged as really very powerful across the board?
The 10 skills, remembering that some are paired or smushed together, are mental intelligence, emotional intelligence, social support, and then moral compass, which has been paired with spirituality, determination, perseverance, and persistence, which all three have been lumped together or smushed together, as I like to say, optimism, creativity, resilience, action orientation, and passion. And the resilience category, I would say, as well as the determination, perseverance, persistence, are probably the two that resonate most with me. But I would also say that the social support one is just so critical in so many instances.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. As I was reading, well, I read all the stories and thinking about the amazing, almost unimaginable adversity that some of these women faced, and still do. This is the thing that just I know has you passionate about pursuing advocacy for women, because some of these injustices are still in place. But some of these folks just endured things that would have been very difficult to do by themselves. Having a mentor or someone who, was there to back them up and support them, whether it was an older person or a peer, I think that makes such a huge difference. And which stories, I'm just thinking about folks that have read the book and you've gotten feedback about, either which stories or what elements are you hearing people tell you they valued or they got a lot of benefit from?
Well, what people who read the book and provide me feedback with normally say these stories, they don't pick one. They say these stories are so inspirational. And what they also say is, well, I know of these women. These women are very successful women. I mean, Pat Schroeder, who just died last week, she's in the National Women's Hall of Fame and in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. And I mean, her story has a humorous element, but also an incredibly important element for her success in her life. It's called Because I Didn't Get Into Yale. And when she was at Harvard Law School, the dean was very unhappy that there were women at Harvard in the law school. And he invited them all over to his house for dinner, put them in a circle after dinner, and asked them, "Why are you here at Harvard?" And one of the women said, "Because I didn't get into Yale." And Pat says that she used that response to bullying, which is how she viewed how they were being treated at that point in time, throughout the rest of her political professional career, because it so deflated the dean when this woman said, "Because I didn't get into Yale and that's why I'm at Harvard," that Pat saw just the power of the words and standing up to the bullies and doing those kinds of actions. And there are so many stories. I mean, Polly Baca's story, growing up in Greeley, Colorado, when there were signs in the store that said "No Mexicans or dogs allowed." And she says at 3 years old, and the church was segregated, and it was actually a combination of the signs in the store and the segregation at the church, that at 3 years old made her determined that she was going to end the bigotry and discrimination. But furthermore, she put that responsibility on her own shoulders, that it was her job to end that discrimination. And that motivated her, still motivates her today. And so it's just that. So the passion that people have, the social networking, all of these kinds of skills that they use that, by the way, everyone listening has. These stories are universal. The obstacles that these women faced are obstacles that people face. Men, women, non-binary, everybody face. And they all have the skills, whether they believe they have the skills or whether they know they have the skills.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's why people find it inspirational, because they see Dottie Lamb, who was the first lady of Colorado and did a column in the Denver Post, and think, she had it made. And then they read her story about losing the election for the United States Senate and the devastating impact that it had on her. But the social support that she got finally, that helped bring her out of what was probably clinical depression. And so I want people to understand that these stories are for them, that everyone has obstacles that they have to overcome in their lives. Absolutely everyone.
Yeah. And, that's such an important point, Jill, because don't you think it often happens when we see someone who achieves success, or, we see them at that stage where they seem to have really arrived, we aren't aware of what it took to get there and what they had to face. And what you are doing as a gift to the world, in my opinion, in this book, is showing how every single one of these women who did achieve amazing success, however you define that, because they each had different ways of being successful, but there was a story behind how they got there. And that's, to me, the gift that you're giving in each of in these chapters is kind of peeling back the layer to say, look what was here. Look what they had to deal with.
Right. And it actually reminds me a little bit of the duck that's swimming across the lake or the pond, and you don't see how hard those ducks are working underneath. You don't see all the setbacks and the disappointments and maybe even the failures that people who are successful have. And one of the really interesting things is that almost all of these women said that these kinds of obstacles and situations that they faced in the end became a learning opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that they could learn from this? What skill could they develop? What backbone could they develop? How could they then use these lessons as they move forward in their lives? The two that come to mind most significantly, one said, it debilitated her, I think she said, for 10 seconds. And then the other one said it totally demoralized her for 24 hours. And then they got their backbone, their steel magnolia backbone back, and they said, I will show you, I will learn from this. This is not going to stop me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we ended up with Over, Under, Around, and Through. As the title, because sometimes you do go straight through the obstacle, but sometimes you have to go over it or under it or around it, because it's not going to move and it's not going to get out of your way. But these women were all determined that they would still get to their goals, whatever those goals were, in spite of those obstacles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, one of the terms that I didn't see in there that is probably woven across several of them is the word courage.
It's an interesting thing that you say that, because I don't know. We never had, Ellie and I never discussed that word in the entire time that we were writing the book. And maybe that is what it is. But And maybe some of those women felt that they had courage, but what I believe, since you've actually mentioned to me in our pre-discussion that you think that maybe I had courage, well, what choice? What choice did any of them have? When you have this passion, when there are things that have to be done, when you feel driven to do the kinds of things that these women did, then, it's really just, okay, obstacle, I'm going to step right over you because what are you doing in my way anyway? Just get out of my way so that I can do what I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I don't know that it's that often that any of us think, oh, I've got to use some courage here to address this situation. It's not a conscious thing. But to me, the action-oriented part is I'm going to take this action, no matter what price I have to pay. I've got to do this. I can't sit still and just let this happen. And so to me, it ties in with that. I would love for you to share your own story that's in there because it's so dramatic and your handling of it to me was just amazing.
Well, the story is that 9 months, it's called What's the Worst Thing That Can Happen? That's each of these stories has a title, and that's the title for mine. And the story is that 9 months after my first husband and I were married, his mother and father died in a murder-suicide. We were 22 years old. He had an 18-year-old brother and a 14-year-old brother, and they came to live with us. And we got them through high school, we got them through college, we got the youngest one through law school. And so my attitude, my life experiences are very shaped by what happened when I was 22. And I look at almost every situation and evaluate what is the worst thing that can happen. I counsel the people that I mentor. One of them came to me and said she was in graduate school. She was having a problem with her advisor. And we were talking about how she could approach that. And I said, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? And it reframed how she was looking at the situation and at the problem. We also had that same discussion when she was unhappy with a job that she had. And I said, what's the worst thing that can happen? And she said, they'll fire me. Okay, so what would happen if they fire you? Well, I'll go do this. I'll go get another job. Okay, so if that doesn't happen, I mean, you prepare for the worst thing. You do not obsess. That's very important. You do not obsess about the worst thing. You just think about what it might be. You think about what your reaction would be to that worst situation. And then what happens is the worst thing almost never happens. It does on occasion, but very rarely. And so you are prepared for the entire range of possible outcomes happen. You spend so much energy. Well, I don't want to go talk to my advisor, but then when you do, usually it gets resolved. And so that's the attitude that I bring and have brought to my life and my career.
I think that's such a wise piece of advice there, Jill, in terms of asking that question, because oftentimes if we don't address it consciously, it's something that we're envisioning. We let our imaginations run wild with this worst case scenario. And so we focus on that happening without the other part of it, which is what you asked her to do. Well, so what if that did happen? Then what would you do? And so instead of stopping it, thinking about it happening, taking it another step forward to look at what your choices would be. And I think that's such a valuable thinking skill to be able to do. So we get out of that loop of worry and fretting and whatever along the range of, catastrophizing we might be on, in order to become more proactive and managing of our emotions as well as our responses to specific situations. So we're not taken by surprise.
Well, sometimes there's still surprises.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. That's life. Right.
Right,
That's life.
right. But if you've done a pretty good job of evaluating potential outcomes, then in all likelihood, you've thought about probably 80+% of various outcomes. Yes, there could still be one that you weren't anticipating, but it's probably well within the realm of the kinds of things that you've already thought about and already made decisions about as to what your reaction or what your action would be.
Mm-hmm. I would love for you just to share some of the obstacles that these women faced. What, because, you've mentioned a few of them, but I would love for you to give a range of things that came up as you were talking to them and included in their stories. What are some examples?
Well, one example is Temple Grandin, who many listeners may be familiar with. And Temple Grandin is an animal scientist. She says being a woman in the field of animal science was more difficult ever than having autism. She's also known for being an autistic advocate. And she said she had to work harder and work smarter to prove herself because people just thought she was stupid. And she wasn't admitted to places where she needed to be because she was a woman in animal science. Then there's Marilyn Vanderburg Atler, who was the 1958 Miss America, who is an incest survivor. Her father from when she was 5 years old to when she was 18. And Marilyn, when she was 53, revealed that she was an incest survivor. By that point, she had recovered. She went through 6 years of hell. We'll just use that word. 6 years to recover. She wanted to find one woman who had made it through the recovery process before she started, but she didn't. And then she became that person. She's a beacon of hope and for everyone. And amazingly, she says she gives hope. That's what she does. And then my co-author, Ellie Greenberg, she was in college, exam week, when her parents came and picked her up, took her home, and told her in the 1940s that they were getting a divorce. Nobody got divorced in the 1940s. I mean, it's the reason she didn't make Phi Beta Kappa, because it was so upsetting to her world that her parents were divorcing. But what it also did was it informed every major decision that she made after that, because she was never going to be stuck flat-footed financially like her mother was because of the divorce. It influenced the career she had. It influenced the man that she married. It influenced everything, really, that she did in her life thereafter. And Rachel B. Noel was an advocate for equal education, segregated, grew up in Hampton, Virginia, actually, interestingly enough. Her family, there's an elementary school named for her grandfather or her great-grandfather, not far from where I grew up. She worked for desegregation in the Denver public schools. And she was the first everything African-American on the Denver Public School Board, on the Board of Regents for the University of Colorado. There's a lot of stories of discrimination in the book. Penny Hamilton, who overcame an abusive alcoholic father in her childhood and then survived breast cancer twice. So, I mean, on and on and on, just amazing stories. B. Harris, whose mother was killed the night that President Obama was elected, as I recall, by an extended family member who was never prosecuted. And so how you reconcile those kinds of things when B says her mother was her rock. How do you get through them? How do you do the things that you need to do? And how do you honor them? She's taking many steps to honor her mother.
Those are all so powerful. And, one of the ones that struck me and will stay with me is the gal that had been appointed or elected as a commissioner. And
Oh, Josie Heath.
there was the zoning issue, and there were people, one gal in particular, that was just campaigning and getting signatures for her to get kicked off that board. And she used humor and just doing something outrageous to turn things around dramatically. So the takeaway for me was because I was feeling her sense of injustice and being attacked. And I thought, wow, that would be a tough thing to go through, to have that kind of public attacking in meetings and behind the scenes, and to deal with that. And I know she struggled with it and yet prevailed because she got creative about how she was going to deal with that situation, and ended up, she had so many supporters. And I think for me, just thinking about the takeaway from that one is sometimes the people who are the loudest in speaking against us are a very tiny minority. And we need to get a perspective that allows us to see the reality is we have so many people in our corner, and we can overlook that when we are having to listen to this noise of someone who is not in our corner.
Right. And Josie, that was Josie Heath. And right. I believe that story is titled She Who Laughs Lasts. And I mean, there were advertisements in the paper. There was reporting. They were trying to recall her and another commissioner. There was reporting at every meeting. I mean, it went on for months and months and months. And Josie Heath is she's incredibly respected within Boulder County for all of the good work that she has done. And I can't even imagine. She said her kids were little at the time, and that they would actually take abuse at school because of it as well. And so it was really a very, very unpleasant situation for her.
Mm. Well, as we wrap up, Jill, I would love for you to just share, what are some other tips that you might share that would be helpful for people who are facing obstacles based on what you learned from all these women? What could people do to strengthen themselves or to handle an obstacle that they might be dealing with right now?
Well, one of the things that they need to remember is the only thing that they can control is their attitude. They cannot control the environment. They cannot control other people. They can only control their own attitude. And so actually, I think that was the title of Penny Hamilton's story in here. And that was related to her twice fighting breast cancer. And then we already talked about the one, which I think is very important, and that's to evaluate what is the worst thing that can happen, and figuring out the continuum of possibilities and reactions that you might have to those situations. And then Martha Uriosti's is titled, Why Curse the Darkness When You Can Light One Little Candle? And so try and find the goodness in the situation. Try and figure out what it is that you're supposed to be learning. And make sure that you enlist your support network, your family, your friends, your colleagues, whoever they are. It's so incredibly important for people to... Other people always want to help. And we are never allowing other people to help us because we're trying to be so strong and we're trying to help everybody else. But if we don't let anybody try to help us, then how can anybody else help other people? I mean, it's just a vicious cycle. And so we need to allow our social networks to function, that social support to function, and we need to allow other people to help us.
Those are great. Jill, thank you so much. I want you to know how much I admire and want to just shout out what a great commitment you have and the work that you're doing to highlight women and just create an equitable environment for them. And in particular here, highlighting the obstacles that women in particular have faced, but have universal application, as you mentioned earlier, no matter who you are. These stories will inspire you and also help you see you're not alone, that others have faced very difficult challenges and have prevailed. So thank you for this book in particular, but also your greater body of work that you've been doing and continue to do. Jill, I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much, Meredith. That was such a lovely thing for you to say.
I'd love for you to share, how can people connect with you, learn more about you and your work and get copies of your books?
Well, to connect with me, the best way is through my LinkedIn profile. I do also have a website, jilltiejen.com, JillTietjen.com. And the books are available at any favorite bookstore. They're available online through multiple sources. The first Her Story, A Timeline of the Women Who Changed America, is a HarperCollins book, but it's available through Amazon. Hollywood Her Story is available through Lions Press or through Amazon. And Fulcrum Publishing is the publisher for Over, Under, Around, and Through, or through any online purchasing as well.
That's great. Well, thank you, Jill, and I'll look forward to hearing about your next book because I know it's coming.
Thank you, Meredith, so much for having me today.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our 2 books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free facilitator guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.